is, what is a madhab? What is a school of law? Let's just ask that question. What is a madhab? That's what we came to study. Obviously, all of you have some idea of what a madhab is, or you wouldn't have come here. Right? So, what is a madhab? Yes?
A body of legal decisions and methodology.
Okay, so that's no question about that, right? A madhab, a school of law, is a body of opinion. So we have a body of opinion which has a certain inner consistency, right? I mean, it's not monolithic, but you have a body of opinion, and those opinions do change. It's true that at a certain point, maybe that change no longer continues to be as active as it was before, but George Maqdisi doesn't really accept any of those definitions. He wouldn't deny that that is the case, but George Maqdisi regards the school of law to be essentially related to the endowed college, and therefore it is essentially a guild. So he argues that the schools of law are very much guild organizations as they develop. Not in the days of Imam Malik or Abu Hanifa, but as they develop 200 years later. They take on the characteristic of a guild. Now again, this is an ointment fly. This is a fly in the ointment, but this is a very important question. Because once you have endowed colleges coming into the picture, which are not there in the days of the first generations. Okay, you do have endowments, but the endowed college is something that develops. It develops in the 4th century in particular of the Islamic era, of the 10th century of the Common Era. So once you have endowments, wealthy endowments, in all the great cities, supporting the schools take on an organizational, administrative, bureaucratic nature of their own. And that's very, very important. And again, if we go back to Al-Hussein's assertion that you have a body of opinion that ceased to develop in the last 300 years, that may or may not be true. But if it is true, and there is certainly something like that happening, then again, what happened to these schools? What happened to these endowments? Is the problem here, or is the problem elsewhere? So this is really important. And this whole question of, do the schools become actual organizations? Do they become guilds? This is a very important question. The law schools were intellectual movements. You know, whatever else they were. You know, they're bodies of opinion, they may be guilds, they are affected very much by endowments, but they are certainly intellectual movements. And they are among the most important intellectual movements in the Muslim world. The Islamic world produced theologians, philosophers, grammarians, scholars of language, Sufis, muhaddiths, scholars of hadith. Of course, it produced many things, but the greatest compendium of work, and in many ways the most brilliant, was law. This was the center of the genius of Islamic civilization. And that law, as it developed, was based on the schools, without any question. The only thing that really compares to law in the history of Islam is hadith. Hadith, which was a servant of law in many ways. Hadith also has a monumental literature and apparatus, and then also Sufism. And Sufism, as it developed in Islamic civilization, regarded itself as fundamentally planted in the law and as growing out of the law. And one of the things that we'll see with the Sufis is that they are the most comprehensive because they try to bring everything together. The law, the language, the theology, philosophy, the debates, and so forth. But as an intellectual movement, the only way to really understand the law is to ask the kind of questions that we have referred to tonight. Because intellectual movements only begin to make sense when you understand the forces that are behind them. Traditionally, perhaps, if you were to ask a Muslim, why do we have schools of law? If you look at a lot of the traditional books, it's just sort of a natural thing, right? That you have the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he transmits to his companions. Some of the companions are more prominent than others. Some of them give legal opinions. Some of them are judges. They in turn go to different places and they settle in different places. Then you have the successors who succeed them in the next generation in those places. And then finally you get a great imam and you have a school. This is the way that the development of the schools of law has often been looked upon in traditional Islamic thought. In other words, it's just sort of a natural thing. And it's a continuum from the Prophet ﷺ to the great Imam. Okay, now let's begin with some of the paradigms. I call this the inventory of paradigms. How do we think about the origins of Islamic law? What are the ideas that we have? Well, let's just begin with some basics that are very important. First of all, none of the schools had a founder as such. Abu Hanifa did not found a Hanafi school. Malik did not found a Maliki school. He didn't have a charter that was signed. He didn't call his disciples around him. Not a single one of the imams, whether they were Sunni or Shi'i, regarded himself as a founder. All of them regarded themselves as transmitters and as embodiments of tradition. This is really important because obviously one of the questions which arises is the question of how did the schools come to be? How did Malik become the center of the Malik school, of the Medinan school, and not, for example, somebody else? Malik, of course, is great, but there were people before him that were equal in stature. There were people after him who were also very great. So how does it come to focus on him? He didn't gather the people around himself and say, follow me. On the contrary, Imam Malik, who had tremendous authority, he had an aura of authority that nobody in his generation had. But he was himself very humble. And he would even say that I'm not very good at this, giving legal judgments, something I don't do well. So he always played himself down. But he became the authority. So the schools were not founded by their founders. The people that their eponyms, as we say, the people that they are attributed to, they were founded by disciples. They were founded by men and women of later generations. So this is really important. None of the schools has a charter. Okay, so you can't really date when did the Maliki school begin. And you can't say that, the Hanafi school is older because Abu Hanifa is, 10 years older than Imam Malik. It doesn't work like that because Abu Hanifa was the heir of a tradition. And Malik was the heir of a tradition. And this can be said about every one of the imams. And they simply become the epitome of that tradition. What we're going to talk about tonight, which is much more central to the way the Maliki school developed, and probably law schools in general, is practice. In other words, there were always human beings in the process who were living embodiments of what was being transmitted, who had mastered that and who embodied it in every way. So that just to be with them, just to be around them, was to get the whole picture. And of course, the first person would be the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That the Prophet is a complete human being. From our point of view, theologically, a perfect human being. And he embodies human perfection. And although he teaches you how to pray and how to make ablutions before you pray and how to wash and how to buy and sell and how to do other things, you get the whole picture from being with him, because you are, after all, companions, men and women. So Islam is a living reality. It's not a disembodied text. It's not a disembodied text. You know, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't a phonograph, or he wasn't a radio. He wasn't a mouthpiece only. He was a living human being. And he kept around him his companions 23 years, 2 full decades and more. This is really important. And then, how did his companions transmit the message to the people after them? The same way. So always you have not the transmission of isolated, disembodied texts, but you have the transmission of a living existential reality. And because that's the case, there may be many things that don't have to be said, that can be left unspoken. Okay? So this, in fact, will be one of the greatest debates of all in Islamic legal theory. That what is the relationship of the text when it's disembodied? Such as it would be for you and me today if we go to Tirmidhi, or we go to Muslim, or we go to another source of hadith, and we just take a hadith. That's a disembodied hadith. We don't know if it was from Mecca or from Medina. We don't know if it's early or late. We may not even know what it means, even though we know the Arabic perfectly. But we may not even understand what it's about. It's just like if I brought you right now, let's say 100 photographs from your trip to Turkey last summer. Let's say that you went with us to Turkey last summer. We brought 100 photographs. Okay, and they're all different photographs. And I could show them to someone who didn't go, and they would say, well, that's pretty, that's interesting. But a person who was actually there would say, oh yes, this was in Edirne, this was in Istanbul, this was in Kayseri, this was in Konya, this is what we did there. You see, because all the pictures would make sense to them, because they took in the experience. So the pictures for them are embodied. They have real meaning, and they can comment on them. This is really important. This is really, really important. So these are paradigms, the textual origin theory and the practice origin theory. How did you qualify that? And they would say, this is zahir. This is zahir. It apparently means that, but when we look really close, it doesn't. And you say, why? And they would say, because in what capacity did the Prophet ﷺ say this? Did he say it in his capacity as a universal lawgiver? In which case it would be definitive text. Or did he say it as ruler of Medina? Because he was also the ruler of Medina. And if he said it in that capacity, then you have to have the authorization of the ruler to do this inside the city. And that's what Malik will say, and that's what Abu Hanifa will say. And this just gives you an example that a lot of times you have a text which appears to be like that's the way it is. And yet when you think about it and you look at it, you say, but that's probably not what it meant at all. For example, how does the hadith go? لا يشد الرحال إلا لثلاثة, right? Is that how the hadith goes? You know, that we don't pack up our animals to set on a journey except for 3 mosques. Which are which 3 mosques? Right, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Now, some people say that means you can't travel to any other mosques. Haram. Okay, now is that what the hadith is about? That hadith, you see, is again zahir. It's not a nas. And almost all the fuqaha would say that hadith is about vows. And it's like, so when you make a vow that I'm going to go to, let's say, the great mosque in Cleveland to pray i'tikaf, you know, I made that vow and now I regret that I made that vow. I got sick, I couldn't go, that was Ramadan. Do I have to keep that vow or not? And that hadith says that we do not, you know, pack up our animals and set out for the mosque unless it's Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. In that case, you have to keep the vow. But in the case of, like, let's say I wanted to go to Cleveland to pray in the mosque in Cleveland, I could do that anywhere in Chicago. I could do that anywhere else, you see. So this is really, really important, and I think this is one of the most important things to get out of the class, because when we ask this whole question, like, why are there schools? What do we do with these schools? A lot of people don't understand that the sources of the law are much more conjectural than they ever imagine. And that's why a school, whatever else a school might be, and whatever else a school might have developed to become, like a guild, for example, they are standard ways of interpretation. That this is how we deal with that. So for Imam Malik, again, the whole issue about the Quran is, yes, it's authoritative, but how do you interpret it? How do you interpret it? How is your exegesis? And so, for example, for Imam Malik, the general statement, you know, is regarded to be a conjectural statement. And the general statement is regarded to be zahir, apparent, but not nas. Abu Hanifa is the opposite, by the way. You see, you'll see this when we come to Abu Hanifa, he's the opposite. It has a reason. There's a reason to this. You see, many of us, we deal with Islamic law as if everything is tawqifi. Like, brother, this is the way it is. This is the way you've got to do. Again, go to your precepts. The precepts of Islamic law is al-aslu at-ta'lil. Al-aslu at-ta'lil. That the basic precept of law is that everything has a rationale. Not the other way around. In other words, everything we're told to do has a reason. It has a rationale. It has maqasid. It has ends. And if you don't know that, then you're not a faqih. Okay, you've got to understand that there's a purpose for this. Okay, now, that's what this is all about. That what are the rationales? You know, what was the purpose of this? Because was it to create difficulty and hardship? No. And in fact, there's this beautiful hadith in Muslim, you know, where Imam Ibn Abbas is teaching, and Maghrib comes in, and he doesn't stop. And one of the Najdis, they get in the hadith, you know. The Najdis comes up and he says, As-salat, as-salat. This is in Muslim. As-salat. He said, it's time to pray. And Ibn Abbas said, you teaching me the Prophet's religion? He said, sit down. And then he said, and then the hadith says, لا يجعلن أحدكم للشيطان من نفسه جزءا. Is that how it goes? لا يجعلن. Yeah, but it's the same story. Yeah. So that the hadith starts that way. Ibn Abbas said, don't let any of you make Satan part of yourself. And that's what it's about, because this man who says, no, we have to pray right now, he said that's a person who Satan is part of him, because the Prophet often joined Dhuhr and Asr, and he often joined Maghrib and Isha. And that's what Ibn Abbas was showing him, was that in this case you can do that. Now, we're not going to go into that particular ruling, but the thing is that when you become hard and fast, then it's like something comes in there that didn't really belong. You know, so